Hello and welcome to this LRN ICA webinar that today is going to focus on the report recently published by LRN, Caught in the Middle. A little bit more about that in a few minutes' time, but before we come to that, some words of introduction. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. You'll have an active part to play in today's event. Again, I'll talk more about that in a moment. My name is Tim Tyler. I'm the Vice President of the ICA, and I'm delighted to be joined by Meredith, Imogen, and Lance. And I'm going to invite Meredith, Imogen, and Lance to introduce themselves in just a few moments' time. Of course, we're also joined by you, and that gives you the opportunity to raise your questions and add your observations to the discussion. We're here for as much as an hour. That's a lot of our time. And I hope that we can get best value from that time by ensuring that this is as interactive as possible. So please use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform. You'll see that towards the bottom. The chat function is something separate, and it's wonderful to hear comments where people are joining us from around the world on the chat function. But there's a separate question and answer facility. And I encourage you, please, to add your thoughts, your questions, your observations into that Q&A section. And I'll try and keep an eye on that over the next few minutes. So can I invite my colleagues to briefly introduce themselves and maybe share a little bit about why they're here to join this conversation. So Imogen, can I come to you first?
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. And it's brilliant to see everybody coming in hello from Azerbaijan. We've had Finland, Ghana, so a really brilliantly wide international audience. I'm Imogen Haddon. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer of News Corp, and I oversee our global compliance program. We are a news media company. We're owned by somebody, somebody you might have heard of, Rupert Murdoch, and we have some fantastic brands across the world: the Times of London, Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal, HarperCollins book publishers, as well as digital real estate companies, and Foxtel in Australia and News Corp Australia. I oversee, as Global Chief Compliance Officer, I oversee the bribery sanctions, modern slavery, all the code of conduct, all the juicy, exciting things that a lot of you probably oversee as well. And I've been at News Corp now for since 2012. My maths is not working, but 13 years that is. So I joined as the Chief Compliance Officer of News International back in 2012 when the company was running into a bit of a UK crisis at the time with the phone hacking scandal. I think that's me covered, Tim. Thank you.
Imogen, thank you, and thank you for joining us today. Lance, can I come to you?
Of course you can, Tim. Good afternoon, Tim, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lance King, and I am Head of Compliance at Virgin Media O2. So for those of you based in the UK, you will be probably familiar with us. For those that are not, Virgin Media O2 is a joint venture that was created in 2021 following the combined forces of the O2 mobile business, of which I worked previously, and also Virgin Media, which was predominantly focused on fixed and broadband services. We offer connectivity services to over 45 million customers, and in doing so, we have the pleasure of being a multi-regulated firm. So regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, also by Ofcom, and then the usual ICO and other regulators as well. Just from a career perspective, I've been with Virgin Media O2 for just over 10 years, leading the UK compliance programme. Prior to that, I worked in the retail banking sector, so as a director running some branches in the south of England. So I have experience both in terms of leading in the front line and leading compliance functions as well.
Lance, thank you, and welcome to this event. And finally, can I come to my co-host, Meredith?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. So very happy to be here. A good morning to those coming from the Eastern Standard Time, which is where I am. I'm in the on the East Coast in the United States. I'm an ethics and compliance advisor at LRN. Um, my function at the company is advising clients on best practices in their ethics and compliance programs. So my background prior to that, I've been at LRN for a couple of years now, but I came from an in-house compliance background previously. So I was first in a regulatory compliance role at a small biotech startup, and then most recently, a few years in the corporate compliance department at a very large global healthcare company. So that's sort of my background. Coming in, it's been wonderful to see compliance risk from really all angles and all industries. So I've learned a lot in a couple of years, and I continue to learn from the folks such as those on this call. So thank you for having me.
Okay, Meredith, thank you. So can I briefly set the scene? Over the next 50 or so minutes, we're going to explore the key provisions and challenges contained within that report, Caught in the Middle. To set the scene first, though, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the global picture around compliance. I might be a little bit controversial in doing this, but what I hope to do is provide the context, set the scene a little for some of the challenges that we face in compliance at the moment. Meredith, I think you've kindly then agreed to set out the key provisions of the report, to summarize the key takeaways, which I hope will set the scene for the discussion that will then follow. And we're going to pick out some of the key themes from that report and ask ourselves, why does it matter? What are the challenges? What can we do in response to this? First of all, though, can I just briefly set the scene? And I'm going to be perhaps a little bit controversial. I'm not speaking for LRN or ICA in this. I'm going to give some views that I'm sure many of us will agree with. But I think they set the scene for a conversation around compliance. So a good place to start for me, I think, is to recognize the complexity that we currently are currently challenged by within compliance. We use this term VUCA, don't we? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous to describe the challenges, whether that's in the context of seismic geopolitical changes across the planet. My goodness, the news in the last couple of days, Meredith, that Mr. Trump, your president, is rowing back on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, extraordinary challenges that were unimaginable just a few years ago. At the same time, we're seeing regulatory uncertainty and economic headwinds that are changing decision-making, challenging decision-making at every level. And of course, that staggering level of technological innovation. So this, I think, provides the context for the work that we're doing. And at the same time, we've seen in recent reporting that compliance costs globally are now being measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Vast amounts of money are being invested within compliance. So there is a growing awareness that we are expensive. And of course, that creates a challenge around how do we present value for money? All of this change and all of the regulatory activity that we're aware of and we can see on the horizon is, of course, driving us within compliance increasingly towards a reactive stance, where we have to respond to regulatory changes and challenges. We have to ensure that our businesses are match fit, are responding to the relevant requirements, and that is properly reflected in our culture, in our systems, in our automated activity, and so on. But having said that, there's uncertainty within this. So, for instance, we saw significant change as a result of the financial crisis 12 years ago. That led to increased regulatory activity, an increased focus on liquidity, for instance, prudential issues. Now we're seeing, particularly in the US and the UK, governments are moving away from that. The mood music is more towards reducing regulatory requirements and responding to the economic headwinds. Having said that, of course, it's more complex than that, and the EU is simultaneously generating a massive change agenda that all 27 member states are locked into. So this, I think, creates the context for our conversation today. It makes it more challenging, more engaging, I suggest, but also more immediate and relevant for us to consider some of the issues that the report sets out. Before I finish, though, can I just add one more observation, which I think highlights where we are currently? And that is with reference to an expression that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And that is, if you think compliance is expensive, you should try the cost of non-compliance. I've heard that for decades. And look, there's truth in it. Of course there is. It gets very, very expensive if we make significant errors in the context of compliance. But it is not the whole story. And I wonder whether we, as a profession, need to move beyond that mindset, to think more in terms of how we can drive, underpin, and enable business, not just good business, but all business, the commercial activity as well, in order to ensure and cement our viability in the long-term future of business planning, given all the challenges that we've just touched upon. So that really is just aiming to set the scene, maybe get us thinking about some of the issues that we face, but also, and I think importantly, to highlight the importance of those issues that we're going to be talking about now and the opportunity that we have to use them to affect the narrative within our businesses, the way that we position and present ourselves within the businesses that we serve. I'm now going to get off my soapbox, and I hope that's useful in terms of setting the scene. It may be that it divides opinion, and that's fine. What I hope won't divide opinion, though, is the report itself. And Meredith, I hope that offers a segue for you perhaps to provide some insight to the report that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. So thanks, Tim. I think, we do need to be position ourselves appropriately, I would say, because the larger context of what's going on, it's inextricably linked to how we're going to run our businesses, right? So it's very important to set the scene. So I appreciate you doing that. So diving into the report itself this year, caught in the middle is the theme. You'll see a lot of the findings really do speak to middle management in particular, some gaps that we're seeing widen over time. So in the 2025 program ethics and compliance program effectiveness report, so that's the full title, caught in the middle. This year is the 11th year that we're publishing at LRN, publishing this report, going over the findings that we see from. In the past, it was only surveys of E&C professionals. This year, we actually, for the first time, have also included employee experiences. So we've surveyed employees as well. So just to give you a little bit of methodology before I dive into those findings so you have that context, we surveyed 1,500 E&C professionals and 1,500 employees. So we really got a nice juxtaposition of experiences between those two groups to get that deeper insight into really what's being felt on the ground, because that's so powerful. You know, it's easy to kind of get lost in the compliance department is doing X, Y, and Z, and here are our initiatives, and you know, you can kind of get tunnel vision into what's going on in the department itself, but to really see what's happening to folks on the ground outside of the compliance function is very powerful stuff. So we did get some insights that are unique to this year's version of this report. So to give you, again, some more context around methodology, I think it's important to explain how we measure success. And you'll see in the report that we talk a lot about low impact, medium impact, and high impact E&C programs. Just to make sure that's well understood how we determine that, we do have respondents rating their organizations against a series of questions. So asking themselves around the categories of ethical decision-making, such as, you know, are the choices employees make animated by values or by expediency? Very important dimension here to look at. Then the other piece of it would be around organizational justice. So, you know, are senior executives and high performers held to the same standards of conduct as any other employee? And then freedom of expression. So do employees speak up? Do they contribute willingly? Do they exchange ideas freely? Really important to understand those dimensions behind an E&C program. And then we put that all together, you know, we rank the answers to those particular questions, and then we put those answers into buckets. And so then we have a kind of a ranking system behind what we would consider a low impact, a medium impact, or a high impact compliance program. So just wanted to put that out front, so because you will see in this report a lot of references back to low, medium, and high impact. So that's what determines that. So that gives you a nice background here to go into some of the key findings. So there is a very big benchmarking gap. So right up front, high impact programs are almost 2 times more likely to use benchmarking data in addition to other reporting tools, such as, you know, things around data analytics, automation, than medium impact programs, which is really, really interesting because, you know, you do expect, you know, if you think about it logically, the high impact and low impact, there's going to be a gap, of course, and it's going to be fairly wide, right? But high impact to medium impact, very interesting to see that there's a very wide gap in this particular category. So the other thing that's very interesting is the gap keeps widening over time. So we have measured this over time, over the past several years, and we're seeing that it is increasing. It's the widest it's been. So I thought that was a really interesting finding for this year's report. The middle management perception gap. So this goes into perceptions of middle management making difficult decisions in line with company values versus executives doing that. So you see a very big drop off between the executive level and the mid-management. So there was actually a 42-point gap between the two. So you're really seeing a very, again, we did name this one Caught in the Middle for a reason. So here's another example of that sort of mid-management drop-off where things are just not permeating the way that you would hope. So for misconduct trends here, so another finding that we found out this year was that it was about almost double high impact programs utilizing misconduct trend analysis compared to, so it's like 63% of high impact programs compared to 33% of, again, medium impact programs are using misconduct trend analysis. So again, looking and this, I feel like I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, but at the risk of doing so, you could definitely see this trend from the top and the middle. Big drop off from the high impact to the medium impact. So that gap continues. Another really interesting finding, and this is something that has come up a lot in a lot of conversations that I've had with clients, the generational divides. LRN has explored a lot of this sort of the idea of Gen Z coming in, and eventually very soon they will be dominating the workforce. So we're looking at how are they being folded in and brought into organizations from an ethical standpoint. Are they understanding what the importance of compliance? This has been explored in our Benchmark of Ethical Culture report in 2024. It's also coming up in our Code of Conduct report. We're seeing a lot of findings that really underscore that Gen Z employees are skeptical about, is my manager being fair? Are they being held accountable? Are we? What's the sort of underlying reason for it all? There's a lot of sort of why. So we're really finding that an interesting thread, and something that again is, I think, of interest to a lot of people. In this year's report, just to bring it back to the findings in the report, Gen Z employees were found to be 2 times more likely to express skepticism about manager fairness compared to other generations. The other thing that's really interesting here is that less than 50% of Gen Z workers believe that their managers hold themselves to the same ethical standards as others. So you're seeing, again, this kind of wide skepticism and questioning about who plays by the rules and why does that matter, and there's this hesitancy, to really be a part of something if it's not well understood. So again, we can go, and I think we'll definitely take that one to the full panel here and discuss that at more length. But thought that was very interesting personally, because it has come up in a lot of discussions that I've had. Then emerging risks. So high impact programs are 2.3 times more likely to adopt third-party due diligence and supply chain compliance practices than medium impact programs. So you're definitely seeing more sort of mobilizing around truly global and major risks, right? These are things that are not going away, even in tumultuous times when, certain regions might be pulling back on, such as the U.S., pulling back on FCPA, enforcement and so forth. You're definitely still seeing that these are major risks because we are in a global environment. So you do have to keep in mind, how's this going to impact the whole compliance program? It's not just a piece of it, and we're in an interconnected world. So that's an important thing to point out here. And then, persistent challenges, I think just in general, organizations continue to face the same hurdles that we see year over year. Outdated internal systems is a big one that comes up again and again. Complex, well, just spoke to this actually, complex regulatory environments could not be more complex these days, right? So that, again, is just going to constantly come up as a big risk and a big challenge for organizations. Budget constraints comes up time and time again, right? This is just never going to go away. It's always going to be a concern. Mergers and acquisitions pressures, again, we perennially see that come up. And staff shortages is another big one. So wanted to point those out as well, because we are still seeing those come up in notable ways. So that sets the scene, I think, Tim, for our discussion, so we can kind of dive into a few of these and see how things are unfolding.
Meredith, thank you so much. And exactly as you say, that does, I hope, provide a context for some discussion around the issues. And a quick reminder to everyone, I can't see any questions at the moment in the question and answer feed. Please add them as we go along, or any particular observations, and we'll try and factor that into the discussion. But Imogen, I'd like to start, if I may, coming to yourself. I remember LRN's publication at this time last year, which of course is very similar in nature, but it has evolved since that time. And when, on the run-up to this, Imogen, you mentioned that as a result of that report, you've learned some lessons within Suncor, and it has generated some fairly wide-ranging change. I think it would be really interesting to hear from you about that change, reminding ourselves that this isn't just a theoretical, dry, distant exercise. Actually, this is intended to make real changes within the professional lives of the people that we serve. But Imogen, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Tim. And thank you for that brilliant introduction, both to the context and the report, both of you. Yes, I brought up the report last year because I was reading it last year, and one thing that had struck me was we'd just begun to realize how important managers were in our compliance program. And it was almost as if, I know the DOJ obviously updated their guidance, and they also emphasized the importance of managers. So I think we were both picking up on that, and that's what the LRM report was picking up on. And it really got us thinking, and we realized that we had a huge gap between what we in the compliance department thought that managers knew that they were responsible for, and what actually managers thought they were responsible for. And it is that, and Meredith, you talked about this gap between you and the compliance department and what you think is happening and what's happening actually on the ground. There really is that big gap. So we went out and we discovered that managers weren't clear about what their responsibilities were with respect to compliance. And a lot of people really didn't know even what compliance meant. And so we really, last year, it was our main goal to try and make sure we communicated properly what managers' responsibilities were. And we did that by 3 short micro-learnings, because we're all hearing about how micro-learnings are the way forward. And we really sat down with a blank sheet of paper and we asked managers, you know, what do you think compliance is? And we sat down with lots of workshops and lots of different people from different business units, different organizations, and different roles of managers. We're hitting everybody who oversaw one or more persons. So that's a very wide definition of managers. And we then drafted out 3 modules. And the first was what compliance means for managers. So what do you need to know? What is compliance? And we went back to basics of, you know, we've obviously got the laws, but also we should be asking ourselves, not only can we, but should we? It's got the ethics around it as well. So going back to very much basics. But it was really simple things like make sure you really think about the risks in your own department. Talk to your team about those compliance risks. Make sure you read the policies. Put compliance on the agenda. And then the second module was how we really drive that culture of compliance, being a role model. And then lastly, what is a manager's role when someone speaks up? And each of these short videos were only 3 minutes long, and we think they really sort of ensured that managers knew that they were responsible for compliance, because we were really disappointed to see in some circumstances, you know, the managers hadn't taken the anti-bribery training. And it was like, I was shocked by this, but when we sort of enforced how important it was and their important role in setting the culture of the firm, I think everybody took that on board and they were quite pleased that they've got this responsibility. So we're continuing to drive this, but that is a really good example, I think, of how you actually bring a report like this into practice and what you actually do on the ground. Because I think as well, we do sit in our compliance departments and it's really difficult to get out across the business and do things that I think have an effective and high impact with lower resources. So this was a really sort of big, I think, project that achieved that. So that obviously in this year's report, you know, when I'm reading page 9, sorry, not 9, I'm blind, page 12, the widening disconnect trends, and you're looking at that difference, that disconnect that there is between executives and leaders and the people on the front line, the managers that people see every day, because they're the ones that are really crucial for your compliance program. So I think that's a really interesting, you know, the report says there is a gap, but how do you close that gap? I think you've got to do it by a training program targeted at those managers, and you've got to think creatively about how to do that. So that was one practical example, Tim, that we found. Yeah.
And it's really encouraging. I think it gives us a little bit of hope that, yeah, we can use this information. It can make a difference. And it's really interesting also, listening to you talking about your interaction with managers, that you were surprised at, in some ways, how little they were engaged on the issues and the way in which you've addressed that. So thank you. There's a really interesting question, which in some ways goes to the heart of some of the challenges that we face, that's been raised in the question and answer function. And I'm actually going to bring it to the panel now, rather than waiting. And I'm mindful that Imogen, you represent News Corp, big multinational. Lance, you represent Virgin, big, complex, sophisticated, well-resourced organizations. Meredith, likewise, in the context of LRN, global organization leading the way in terms of compliance activity. Some might say, and this is what the question gets to, some might say, well, it's all very well for you, but smaller organizations maybe don't have the data, don't have the systems in order to address this. And maybe that's part of the reason why you've been able to differentiate, Meredith, in the report between the high impact and the medium or lower impact businesses. Now, we are going to come on to talk about the detail of the report. But before we do that, can I just perhaps ask yourself, Lance, initially, and open this out to others, what about smaller businesses? Is it relevant to them? Should they stick around and be part of this conversation? Or actually, really, we're talking about something that is only pitching to those people that have got the resources to do it in a certain way?
I think that is an absolutely fantastic question, by the way. And having reviewed many of these surveys year by year, I think it's important to note that individual compliance functions and individual companies will be going through different stages of maturity. When I joined the O2 team originally, we were going from the Office of Fair Trading to the Financial Conduct Authority. So we literally had to build a framework from scratch. And then you have the opportunity, if you're coming to a new business or a joint venture, again, building a framework from scratch. And when you're at that kind of base camp level where you've got to focus on the basics, and you look at a report like this is almost like the future. Take you 3 to 5 years to kind of get there, but you can develop the maturity. And I think for me, when you look at compliance maturity phases, you've almost got your minimum standards, which are your basics. That's what you need to do. Once you've established that framework, you can then move on to improvement. So benchmarking, beginning to look what's out there and you should be doing. And then that final sort of stage, which I suppose in terms of the LRN survey, we would call the high impact programs. Those are like the values led, the outcomes based kind of programs that are really quite kind of progressive and leading the way. But what I would say specifically to answer the question, I think what I try and do every single year is our compliance officers will have their traditional compliance monitoring plan, but give consideration to what your compliance maturity plan is, what phase you are on, and what improvement measures that you can make. So an acknowledgement that you may be at the basic level. A year of good progress would be to go from basic to kind of benchmarking. And for me, when I look at my compliance maturity plan, there are always kind of three components to this. And Tim, this links back to something you said earlier. Firstly, how can I support the business in delivering better outcomes? And that's better outcomes for customers and better outcomes from a commercial perspective for the organization. Secondly, how can I keep up and ensure the business continues to respond to the external regulatory environment? And then thirdly, how can I improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of the program? So my short answer to that question would be, you're running your own race. Don't be disheartened. Just focus on your 12-month maturity, and over a series of years, you'll get there.
Can I pick up on one thing that you talked about? And I think it's important, particularly if we're in an early stage of maturity, as many who join us might be. And you talked about benchmarking. That, of course, is offering us the ability to determine, well, where are we at now? And if I understand this correctly, and this I think is the question, do we just do this internally so that we can measure progress over time? Or are we doing this internally and externally to try and see, well, where is the peer group in terms of this activity? And if we're going to do it externally, how can we realize that ambition? Can I bring that back to you, Lance, because you raised this question of benchmarking?
So to answer your question, Tim, of course you can. It's both. It's both kind of internal benchmarking. I think the really interesting piece from this LRN survey, which kind of teases out, you've got the tone from the top, you've got that mood in the middle, but for me, where the rubber hits the road is in terms of the frontline employees, which are often, in the case of early careers, and the themes in this survey about Gen Z joining from an early careers perspective. So you need your internal insights, but to continually use external surveys like the LRM one to what is the kind of emerging what is the emerging practice? And I think what you see over years is what is best practice in 2025 almost moves into standard practice in 3 years' time, and then on to kind of like a minimum standards perspective. And I'll use kind of one point to kind of illustrate this. And I think Imogen touched upon the Department of Justice compliance monitoring evaluation program guidance. That had a real shift over the 2 years that they updated that. Whereas now they're talking about compliance officers having access to relevant data sources, compliance officers using data analytics as well. And that's your external regulator saying to you, that's how we see the function providing better market-wide kind of outcomes. So it's to answer your question, Tim, it's both internal benchmarking and external benchmarking. But I'll go back to the point I made in the original question, and I will emphasize this. It's about individual officers and individual companies and functions. You're running your own race. It's all about your improvement. So take from the best and build on and make it more effective.
And
Lance, thank you. Imogen,
yeah.
sorry. Imogen.
Yeah, I mean, I will say when I joined News International back in 2012, for most media companies, compliance at that point was not really a known word that anyone knew what it meant. So we were building from scratch at that point. And I will be brutally honest with you, I couldn't look externally. I just didn't want to look externally at the other companies that weren't media companies, that were regulated companies. I had my head, in the sand, and I did it internally first. And you have to give yourself baby steps. So I would concentrate on building your own program, concentrate on the elements of your program. And we know that the last bit of that program is always going to be monitoring, because you need to establish it's the order of things, the risk assessment, the policies, the training. You go round your circle to create your program, and then you can compare the progress that you've made, and then you start to look externally. Because to be honest, looking externally at this report, it terrifies me, this report, of what, you know, the different data points, and I do have a mature program, I will say, at News Corps now, but I think give yourself baby steps if you're small. And I do think there's a great advantage in being small, in that communication is fantastic and everybody knows what's going on because you're all sitting in one place, and that's the joy of working in a small company. So it's quite fun almost to build that program from scratch. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Meredith, anything you'd like to bring to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, because in my experience as well, you know, the startup that I worked at, we did not have a compliance program at all. So we had to start, you know, from scratch, and we didn't even have a policy, you know, to speak of. So it was coming up with all the policies. It was figuring out where our risks were, where we wanted to go. And you know, I think the biggest thing, at least for me, to go back to is to start when you start at the basics, is really to use those 7 elements of an effective compliance program, as outlaid by the OIG, I believe. I always forget too many acronyms in this world, but making sure that you're going back to where, you know, so where do you start? There's where you start. I think that's the most important thing. And then you build it out. Into Imogen's point, it's absolutely like you hit those notes, you get your policies together, you get your code of conduct, you start your training, and then you can see where you are in, you know, the following year, and you just build on that progress and iterate on it, and then you can compare and benchmark externally and see where you are in a little bit of time.
And of course, in doing that, in the way that you described, Meredith and Imogen and Lance, we've got the opportunity to celebrate successes along the way, to demonstrate how we can link compliance activity to successful outcomes, and to generate the goodwill that's so important to our success and to the cultural strength of the organization. But I'd like to move on, if I may. Lance, you touched on one of the things that the report sets out, and Meredith, you touched on yourself, and that's the Gen Z issue. I think we all find this fascinating. For those joining from the UK, there's been a series of articles in the Times newspaper throughout this week that reports on research that's considered the significant differences in outlook between Gen Z and previous generations. And there are some really surprising things that come out of it. For instance, 50% of Gen Z believe that the UK is stuck in the past. 50%, not you know, half. And there's some other really interesting outcomes from this about willingness to fight and represent the UK, and a bunch of other issues. Now, that's not our focus today. I think one of the things we saw from the report is this skepticism that Gen Z is demonstrating towards their managers, towards their organizations. And that is consistent with some of the other patterns that we've seen. How do we respond to that? How do we ensure the relevance of compliance, which is often perceived as just being about rules, doing the right thing? I'm not saying that's the case, but it's often perceived in that way. How do we ensure relevance to this new emerging group of Gen Z skeptics? Who'd like to give some thought to that? And that's an easy question. Imogen?
I've seen all the Times reports, and it is fascinating stuff. And as a Gen X, I feel very remote from them, Tim. I will say that. But I think the way that we targeted, you know, managers, I think you've got to really try and basic things is understand where these sort of perceptions are coming from, perhaps focus group those areas, like we did with the manager training, and work out how we can try and persuade them. But I guess it all comes down to understanding where they're coming from, why they perceive or why they have this low trust sort of perception, and what we can do to persuade them otherwise, and make them believe in organizational justice and the importance of compliance. So it seems like, it all comes down, and I often think compliance, it's quite simple. It comes down to communication, doesn't it, really? And trying to communicate with them directly and understand them, and try and resolve some of these issues. But that's just an off the cuff. I don't know the answer, but yes, it's.
No,
I think we haven't, considered it, and we haven't looked at it in that segmented way that this report does. So it's a really good thinking point, because we divide people by their roles, but not by their generations. So I think that's been a real insight, that we have to look at things in a different way. Yeah.
I think your work targeting your managers is a really good illustration of how you can proactively address these sorts of challenges. Maybe gives us a little bit of encouragement around this. However, can I come back to one of the things that you said? You talked about the importance of communication, and I absolutely agree with you. However, other research is pointing to the fact that Gen Z don't have perhaps as long attention spans,
Right. Yeah.
in interest in detail as previous generations, for good or for ill. So it makes that communication that much more challenging, doesn't it?
It does. And we're really looking at how we're communicating our program. We cut down our trainings. We do everything in bite sizes now to try and cater for that, because I don't think it's just Gen Z, it's all of us, isn't it? Because of the way that we're looking at our phones, even, all the time. So I think we have to change the way that we're communicating our programs. But again, I haven't sort of worked out the magic bullet, but we do a newsletter every month, and it's the favorite part of my job, actually, writing it's the deep sort of thwarted journalist in me. But I don't know whether that's working, and we're going to review the effectiveness of that, because, the older generation email me and they say they love it, but I just don't think the young people are reading it. So I'm having a meeting later today with communications to look at how we can look at the kind of effectiveness of that newsletter and how we communicate the program to who across the 30,000 staff we have.
Thanks, Imogen. Thank you. Lance, can I bring you into this?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating insight in the survey. And it's made me sort of reflect upon the importance of I'm no communication expert, but a multi-channel approach in terms of communicating, and going back to what I said earlier, that kind of tone from the top, mood in the middle, and rubber the road. And I'm not saying we have this perfect in any shape or form, but we use multiple forms of kind of communication. So we will use the standard communication approach in terms of business change or new policy approach. We also use, we have an internal Facebook workplace, which I know many of our colleagues would be familiar. That is particularly useful in engaging a younger and more junior audience. So photos and posts like that. What we've also done is the compliance team. We did a day in stores. So every single member of the compliance team encanted into a store and just did back to the floor, hosting in the stores and watching and learning from kind of customer interaction. And I would say that was probably one of the biggest things we did that had a massive impact in terms of relevance from compliance to our frontline colleagues. The fact that actually what we went out with was not a kind of brief of, we're going to tell you about the importance of compliance. We went out with a brief of, I want to understand your world. I want to listen to your world. I want to understand the pressures that you deal with. And as a result of that particular engagement exercise, we made some radical changes to the training and competence approach within the organisation to make it more frontline friendly.
That's helpful.
So I say I don't think I don't have a perfect solution to it, but just using multiple approaches.
So we need to move on, but before we do, can I just add one more ingredient to this? We've thought about, of course, there are three elements to communication: your channel, your audience, and your message. So we've thought about the channel in terms of micro-learning, mixing it up, finding different ways, asking how individuals would best like to engage, and some of the other things we've talked about. We thought about the audience, recognizing that there are some consistencies. For instance, our attention span generally is reducing, but also there are some nuances within Gen Z, for instance. But can I ask us about the message? We haven't got time to explore this more fully, but I wonder whether there's a danger that our message gets diluted because there's so much that we want to say and cover. We've got to follow these regulatory requirements. There's a legal requirement over here. We've got supply chain due diligence over here. Well, we need to think about culture. And somehow along the way, we end up with quite a noisy, difficult to grasp concept. And maybe there's value in distilling this down into something far simpler and more straightforward, that's less nuanced. We haven't got time to debate it now, but I think there's an interesting question contained within that. If we had longer, we could figure it out. But can I come to another one of the questions that's been asked? Because I think it really nicely links to one of the key findings within the report. So I'm afraid I don't have the name of who asked the question, but they've asked, do we think regulators should make a greater effort in communicating better with small firms? Now, of course, one of the things that we saw was that there is this difference between high and medium impact in terms of an understanding of emerging risks. And I know, Meredith, you talked about that in the summary. Where do we see this? Is that linked? Is that a regulatory responsibility? Does it rest with us? And if we're a small business and we've only got finite bandwidth, how do we make sure that these new emerging risks that tomorrow will be really important and potentially bite us get the attention that they need? So once again, can I throw that open? I'm interested in people's thoughts here. Meredith, is that something that you'd like to opine on, or?
I'm thinking about it.
Oh, that's fine.
That's a very difficult question to answer. But yeah, I mean, I do think it's a tough one because it always, again, I feel like does come back. Everything seems to, going back to my in-house compliance experience at least, things kind of, you can get bogged down with worrying about the budget, right? So you're always worried about the budget. When you have a shoestring budget, how do you, stay abreast of all of these things and react to them appropriately based on your organization and your function? But I do think there is a lot of opportunity, even though things are moving so quickly, because I think, technology is making everything just accelerate at breakneck speed, it seems sometimes. I do think there is opportunity in some technological advances that we've had. AI we haven't talked about yet. I know that's something that we talk about a lot just in general. That's a big topic of conversation in with a lot of my clients right now as well. But I do think there's some, if you think about it, ways to kind of harness where we are technologically to respond to this risk landscape. We didn't have the capability. I mean, I'm thinking, let's go back even 10 years ago. We weren't able to put in, into Google, alert me when there's a new regulation coming out, for example. You can set up things like that that are, not going to be a risk to you. I'm not saying use AI in a risky, scary way. You want to make sure you're being using your due diligence with that as well, but making sure that you're being smart about what is available to you, because some of these things are not big investments. So I would maybe start with that. I don't know if that really answers the question fully, but that's sort of where my head went initially.
Thank you. So there are tools that we can secure that will help us to do this. We're running short of time, but Imogen, in the space of a few sentences, any thoughts around this?
I don't know whether you're putting forward that regulators should issue better, clearer guidance on emerging risks. Is that what you're? I mean, and I think the DOJ's evaluation of corporate compliance programs, I go back to that document all the time. I read it. I'm a sado. I mean, I must go back to it, you know, at least every week, because I think it's a really good, fulsome document about what questions you need to think about for your compliance program. So I think it's a really good place to start. But, you know, you talk about emerging risk, but there is so much noise, and we've seen in the States as well, is like, you know, with the DEI and also the ESG rollback, you've got to be agile. So you can almost spend so much time chasing your tail, trying to follow all this regulation, but at the end of the day, stick to the basic principles, you know. And I've drawn up the AI principles for our company, and there's not a lot you can say to everybody across 30,000. So keep it basic. Don't put confidential information in there. You know, check what's coming, what's being spat out by AI, and manage your people in your team, that they're using it sensibly. I don't know what more, you know, we talk about emerging risks and the risks of AI. It's sticking to the principles that we all know.
And I think if I can add to that,
Yes.
there's constant information coming out from regulators, but I was head of anti-money laundering for the Gambling Commission in the UK, and I saw regulation from the inside. And one thing we can say about it is that they're generally consistent.
Yeah.
And so if you do invest time to really understand key messages, key pieces of work, and you mentioned one involving the Department of Justice there, then that actually can help you in a whole range of other contexts as well. So we're not trying to simultaneously know everything. It's not necessarily even possible to do that. 30 seconds, Lance. Any thoughts on this before we move on?
I will give you 30 seconds. In
Brilliant.
short,
Thank you.
yes, they can do more. But secondly, I'll give credit to the FCA. They are making a conscious effort on this, and there has been a general shrinkage in terms of the guidance that they send out. So similar to the point that Imogen made, I find the FCA guidance a lot more user friendly and good governance best practice that you'd want to do, rather than it being regulatory driven.
Lance, thank you. And of course, for those from overseas, the FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority. It's the UK main regulator for financial services. We've got just a couple of minutes remaining. I can't believe it, but we have just got a couple of minutes remaining. Can I summarize some of the key things that we've spoken about? And in a moment, I'm going to come to each of our panelists and ask for final thoughts before we close. As I say this, can I thank all those that have asked questions? There are some really interesting challenges and questions contained within the feed. I'm sorry we haven't got to them all, but we've tried to get to those along the way as best we're able. And in doing that, I think it's been really interesting hearing from yourself, Imogen, about how you've implemented the key provisions from last year's report. And fascinating to see some of the challenges that you encountered, but also the value you derived from using that kind of insight. And of course, we hope that we can use this year's report in very much the same way. Lance, I think it was really helpful hearing your evaluation of compliance program maturity. And I particularly liked the three questions. I'm going to share them again, if I may. These are the three questions that you ask yourself about your compliance function. How can I support better business outcomes, firstly? Secondly, how can compliance ensure regulatory compliance? And thirdly, and this is maybe something that we overlook so often, thirdly, how can we ensure efficiency and effectiveness in what the business is doing? It's so, so important and so easily overlooked as a compliance function. But of course, in that context, we recognize the importance of benchmarking. And again, this kind of report can help us in that process. We've thought about our communication. We've recognized the audience, Gen Z, for instance, the channels that we use, that we need to innovate. We need to find new ways to realize effective communication. But we also maybe need to think about our messaging and how we ensure that that is accessible to all. So that's a very quick overview of just some of the key things that have come out of the discussion. I'm sorry if I've not done justice to all that's been covered. As we finish, just some very brief thoughts from each of you, if I may. Meredith, could I start with yourself?
Sure, I know we're sort of coming up on time here. It passed by quickly, but I would say, pay close attention to training and messaging. I know we talked about that a lot on this call, but you really want to make sure it's resonating across all levels and generations, and stay true to the organization's values, because that's really the cornerstone of the messaging. So if you're kind of getting lost in so many details, think back to those basics. What are the values? And staying on message doesn't take a lot of investment and can really have a huge impact. I think that, to me, is a big takeaway, and wanted to leave you with that.
Thank you, Meredith. Lance?
In summary, I would thoroughly recommend investing 30 minutes of your time to actually read the survey. And then secondly, just focus on running your own race and your functions improvement.
Thank you. Imogen?
Take myself off mute. Yes, echoing Meredith, really make sure you work out what makes your audience tick. And I've got journalists and they want to expose and hold people to account. So we say to them, you hold others to account, be accountable. And that's our compliance message. Keep it simple and set yourself a goal and execute on it.
Wow, stirring words. So thank you so much, Imogen, Lance, and Meredith. And thank you, wherever you're joining us from across the world, for joining us for this conversation. It is an interesting time that we're operating in. There are some key lessons that will help us to be more effective if we can draw from this report. But in the meantime, do take care. Thank you.